The cashier's voice cut through the crowded cafe like a blade. His daughter clutched a paper cup of hot chocolate, her eyes wide, as the line behind him began to whisper. That was the moment the CEO at the corner table stood up. "Sir, your card was declined. Before we dive in, take a second to leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind in ways you won't see coming." The cafe was alive with the mid-morning rush, a blur of polished shoes, clipped conversations, and the steady hiss of milk steaming into porcelain cups. The scent of espresso hung thick in the air, sharp enough to cut through exhaustion. At the counter, Daniel shifted from one foot to the other, his work boots out of place against the marble floor. He clutched his wallet with the kind of desperation only someone counting pennies could understand. Emma, his 7-year-old daughter, stood beside him with both hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of hot chocolate, steam curling into her face. She smiled at it like it was a treasure, unaware that the world could turn cruel without warning. "Declined." The cashier's voice was clipped, detached, but it struck Daniel like a slap. He blinked down at the machine, swiping the card again, willing it to change its mind. Another beep, another rejection. The man behind him sighed loudly, shifting his briefcase with impatience. The woman 2 spots back whispered something under her breath, a hint of pity, maybe mockery. Daniel felt his ears burn. "I'll try another," he muttered, pulling out a second card, its edges frayed from years of overuse. He slid it through. Beep, declined. Again. The whispers grew, faint ripples spreading through the line of professionals dressed in wool coats and silk ties. They belonged in this cafe, with its glass cases of pastries priced like jewelry. He didn't. He could feel it pressing down on him, the weight of being seen when all he wanted was to disappear. Emma looked up at him, her big brown eyes wide, confused. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, soft enough that only he heard it. She didn't understand the shame, not yet. To her, the world was still simple. You ask, you receive, you hold your hot chocolate like it's the best thing that's ever happened to you. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's okay, sweet pea." Just a mix-up. He tried to sound casual, but his throat was tight, his hands trembling as he fumbled the cards back into his wallet. The cashier cleared her throat. "Sir, if you can't, From the corner table, a chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound cut clean through the noise, commanding attention in a way that didn't need words. Evelyn Cross rose from her seat. Her tailored blazer was charcoal, her heels sharp against the wood, her hair pinned into an immaculate knot. Everyone knew her by reputation, even if they didn't know her name. The woman who closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast. The executive who never flinched, never faltered, never softened. She didn't speak as she crossed the cafe. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a black card that gleamed like a blade, and placed it on the counter. "I'll take care of it," she said. Her voice was even, cool, unshaken. Daniel froze, humiliation flaring hot in his chest. He wanted to protest, to insist he could manage, but Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Please, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her small hands clutching the cup like it was all that mattered. Pride could be swallowed, hunger could not. He gave a stiff nod. "Thank you," he mumbled, barely audible. Evelyn said nothing more. She didn't linger, didn't console. She simply handed the card back to the cashier, collected her receipt, and returned to her corner table, sliding back into her seat with the same precision she carried into boardrooms. But as Daniel ushered Emma out of the cafe, his shoulders hunched low, she found her eyes lingering longer than they should have. Her assistant leaned in from across the table. "That was unexpected," he murmured. Evelyn didn't answer. She stirred her untouched espresso, watching the door swing shut behind the man and his daughter. For years she had trained herself not to feel, to cut the threads that tied her to anything resembling softness. But something about the way that little girl clutched her cup, The way the man's face tightened, as if holding back an ocean, tugged at her in a place she thought long dead. Evelyn Cross had walked away from countless deals, endless pleads for mercy in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. But this small, fragile moment followed her long after the cafe returned to its hum. She couldn't explain it, not yet. She only knew that something had shifted. What began as a declined card in a crowded cafe was about to ripple outward, rewriting lives that had been trapped in silence for too long. The line of murmurs fell away the moment Evelyn stepped forward. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her very presence carried with it a gravity that bent the room toward her, silencing impatience, cutting short the nervous laughter. She moved with the kind of certainty that made strangers part like water, the staccato strike of her heels against the polished floor, the only sound filling the space between breaths. At the counter, she didn't glance at Daniel. She didn't offer sympathy or small talk. She simply drew a sleek black card from her wallet and set it on the register with a precision that brooked no refusal. "Run it," she said quietly, her tone unshaken. The cashier fumbled to obey, swiping quickly, as if the gesture alone carried authority. Daniel froze. The shame burned so fiercely in his chest it felt like it would split him open. He wanted to protest, to tell her he could handle it, to insist this wasn't what it looked like, but the words clung to his throat like lead. Pride was a fragile shield, and at that moment it was splintering. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Emma tugged gently on his sleeve, her voice almost too small to hear. "Please, Dad." She held her cup tighter, as though the warmth of it was all that kept her safe. Her eyes, wide and searching, met his. And in them Daniel saw not judgment, but a plea. Don't let this moment end in nothing. He exhaled, defeated by her quiet honesty, and gave a stiff nod. Evelyn didn't linger. She took the receipt, slipped the card back into her wallet, and walked back to her table without another word. Daniel muttered a strained, almost inaudible, "Thank you." But it felt like it dropped uselessly to the floor between them. He guided Emma quickly toward the door, his shoulders hunched, as if shielding her from invisible arrows. The bell above the cafe door jingled sharply, and then they were gone, swallowed by the rush of the street outside. The line behind them exhaled in unison, releasing the tension of a scene they would recount in whispers later, each person spinning it in their own way. Evelyn sat down again, but her gaze lingered longer than she intended. She stared at the door, still swinging gently, at the space the man and his daughter had left behind. For years she had watched men unravel in boardrooms, heard their voices crack as they begged for extensions, pleaded for another chance, promised more than they could deliver. She had been unmoved. Cold precision had built her empire, and detachment had been the cornerstone of her survival. But this was different. This wasn't a man bargaining for billions or a leader clinging to reputation. This was quiet collapse. No excuses, no theatrics, only the naked weight of survival pressing down on him, and beside him, the child. Too young to understand why the room had shifted, too perceptive not to feel it. That silence in her eyes lingered longer than the image of the man himself. Her assistant leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice as if the moment demanded discretion. "Why did you do that?" Evelyn's spoon hovered over her untouched espresso. She stirred slowly, watching the swirl, the dark liquid folding into itself, before setting it back down without a sip. "I don't know," she said, and it was the truth. She didn't know why her body had moved before her mind, why she had crossed the line between observer and participant in someone else's humiliation. She only knew she couldn't sit there and let it stretch on. That night, lying in the cool emptiness of her penthouse, Evelyn Cross couldn't sleep. She tossed aside reports, silenced calls, ignored the stack of contracts waiting for her signature. For the first time in years, her mind wasn't gnawed by numbers, projections, or deadlines. It was caught, snagged on a single image, a man with broken pride in his eyes, and a little girl holding her cup as if it were the last spark of warmth in a world determined to remind them of what they lacked. She stared out at the city lights, towers glowing against the dark. She had built her life on steel and glass, on victories measured in headlines and stock reports. But beneath all that noise, a quiet question haunted her. Why couldn't she let go of the picture of a father and daughter walking out of a cafe, carrying not coffee, but the unbearable weight of being unseen? Daniel's apartment smelled faintly of dust and reheated food, the kind of place that carried fatigue in its walls. The heater rattled but never seemed to do much, and the chipped linoleum floors creaked when he crossed the narrow kitchen with a plastic container of leftover noodles. He stirred them in a scratched pan, the hiss of oil filling the silence that hung between him and his daughter. At the table, Emma bent over her sketchbook, tongue poking out in concentration as she drew superheroes with oversized capes and messy hair. The tip of her pencil scratched across the paper, a sound far brighter than the muted clatter of her father's work. He set 2 chipped bowls on the table, presenting them with a flourish. "Voila," he said, forcing cheer into his tone. "Gourmet cuisine, 5-star dining. Don't tell anyone we're spoiling ourselves like this." Emma giggled, setting her pencil down. She twirled a forkful of noodles, playing along. "So fancy, Dad." But then her smile softened. She looked up at him, her voice quieter. "Are we okay?" The question struck harder than any overdue bill ever could. Daniel's grin faltered just for a second. He reached across the table, ruffling her hair. "Of course we're okay. We've got noodles, we've got capes, and we've got each other. That sounds more than okay to me." Emma nodded, comforted enough to take another bite. But Daniel's eyes flickered to the counter behind her, where a stack of envelopes sat like vultures. One had been stamped in red, "Final Notice." He turned his gaze back to his daughter before she noticed, his chest tightening against the weight of promises he didn't know if he could keep. Later, after Emma brushed her teeth and tucked herself beneath her blanket, Daniel sat by her bedside until her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Her sketchbook lay open on the nightstand, a new drawing of a hero with tired eyes, but a shield that never seemed to break. He closed it gently, his throat tightening as he whispered, "Good night, sweet pea." When the apartment finally sank into silence, he wandered back to the small table in the corner where papers were scattered. Not bills this time, something older, something he couldn't quite bring himself to throw away. He slid a sheet free from beneath the clutter. It was a blueprint, lines precise yet incomplete, a fragment of a dream that had never been finished. His hands traced the faint pencil marks, remembering late nights in architecture studios, back when the future still felt like something he could build. He had once imagined designing skylines, structures that could outlast storms. But then the hospital bills came, then the diagnosis. Then the night he held his wife's hand and promised her he'd raise Emma no matter what it cost. Dreams had to be folded away so survival could take their place. He closed his eyes, fingertips pressing into the paper as though the lines themselves might still remember who he was before everything fell apart. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him back. The screen lit up with another notification. "We regret to inform you." He didn't bother reading the rest. Another job application rejected. Another door closed. He set the phone down with deliberate care, like if he placed it too hard, it might shatter more than just glass. Across town, Evelyn Cross stood in her penthouse, framed in glass. The skyline sprawling at her feet like a conquered kingdom. The lights of the city glittered against her reflection, but all she saw staring back was herself, alone, encased in silence. Success had given her everything except softness. The floor-to-ceiling windows glowed with proof of power, yet her chest felt hollow, as though every deal she'd won had carved out another piece she hadn't noticed losing until now. 2 lives, worlds apart. One surrounded by glass towers, the other by peeling paint. Yet in the stillness of their separate nights, emptiness was the only thing they both could hear. The skyscraper's lobby, stretched upward, like it had been designed to make men feel small. Polished marble gleamed under a canopy of chandeliers, and the air smelled faintly of perfume and money. People in tailored suits moved quickly, phones pressed to their ears, voices pitched in the language of business deals and deadlines. Daniel pushed his mop cart quietly across the expanse, rubber wheels squeaking against the floor. He kept his head down, as he always did, blending into the background with practiced invisibility. It was easier to disappear in places that had already decided he didn't belong. He paused near the base of the grand staircase, wringing out the mop, his rough hands steady despite the exhaustion pulling at him. The water rippled with each movement, catching the light like liquid glass. A few drops splashed onto his boots, but he didn't care. He had long stopped noticing the small indignities of work that stained his uniform and his skin alike. Above, on the mezzanine, Evelyn Cross moved with her board members in a tight cluster, their clipped words bouncing against the vaulted ceilings. She walked at the center, her presence commanding the group without effort. Her charcoal suit was razor-sharp, her stride even sharper. She had spoken about quarterly projections only minutes ago, and yet her mind was already calculating the next acquisition, the next mountain to strip down for resources and rebuild in her name. Success was constant motion. Then her gaze drifted downward. There, at the base of all that glass and power, she saw him, the man from the cafe, the one whose daughter had clutched her cup of hot chocolate like it was salvation. He was bent slightly at the shoulders, mop in hand, his face half hidden by the angle of his bowed head. His uniform bore stains that refused to fade, the fabric worn from years of use, and still there was something in the way he moved, slow, methodical, dignified even in silence, that made her freeze mid-step. The board members didn't notice. They kept walking, arguing about budgets, their voices thinning into background noise. Evelyn stood still, staring. As if sensing her eyes, Daniel lifted his head. Their gazes collided across the cavernous space, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. For a brief second, there was no marble, no chandeliers, no sharp edges of wealth and poverty dividing them. Only recognition, vulnerability, the quiet, unspoken ache of two people who carried very different weights but shared the same gravity pulling them down. Daniel's eyes flickered with surprise, then caution. He looked away almost instantly, resuming his task with rigid focus, as if willing the moment never to have happened. But Evelyn felt it still, a hum beneath her ribs, something unexplainable that lingered even as the lobby continued to buzz with footsteps and chatter. She excused herself abruptly, turning to her assistant. "That will be all for today. I'll review the numbers later." "But, Miss Cross, we still—" "I said later." Her tone brooked no argument. She pressed two fingers briefly against her temple, masking her exit behind the convenient excuse of a headache. The board members exchanged puzzled glances, but didn't stop her as she walked toward the private elevator. In the mirrored walls of the lift, Evelyn saw her reflection, flawless and cold, exactly as she had built it to be. Yet her mind was not on her own face. It was on his, the downward tilt of his eyes, the rough lines carved by struggle, the quiet endurance that clung to him like armor. She couldn't explain why it unsettled her, only that it had. That night her penthouse was silent. The city sprawled beneath her windows in a sea of lights. She should have been reviewing contracts, should have been preparing for tomorrow's negotiations. Instead, she stood barefoot against the cool glass, wine untouched on the table behind her, and replayed the moment in the lobby. It wasn't attraction, it wasn't pity, it was something stranger, something raw. Power and poverty had brushed shoulders in that marble cathedral, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Cross had felt the air crackle with something she couldn't bend to her will. The reminder of humanity, stripped of labels, lingered long after the skyline blurred into the night. The building was hushed, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than peace. It was after hours, when the suits and polished shoes had retreated to their cars, their penthouses, their late-night meetings over expensive liquor. The conference room sat empty, save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint streaks of city glow spilling through glass walls. Daniel moved quietly from one room to another, his bucket rolling behind him, the mop handle balanced on his shoulder. Beside him, Emma trailed with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her sneakers squeaking softly against the carpet. She wasn't supposed to be here. He knew that. But sometimes the choice wasn't between right and wrong. It was between leaving her at home alone or bringing her into the world he worked in after dark. She was quiet, observant, content with her paper and pencils. That was enough. In one of the larger rooms, Daniel set to work on the windows, the spray bottle hissing as he wiped down streaks left by careless hands. Emma climbed onto a chair at the long table and spread out her supplies. She began tearing small squares of Post-it notes, sketching quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her superheroes were always the same, strong but tired, capes trailing like burdens, eyes shadowed but kind. Tonight, she scattered them across the glossy surface of the conference table, arranging her heroes like an army ready for battle. The door opened. Evelyn Cross stepped inside, heels clicking against the floor before pausing at the sight before her. She had stayed late to finalize a contract, another string of numbers that meant victory to shareholders. But the sterile room wasn't empty as she expected. A little girl sat in the center of the table's vast expanse, surrounded by tiny drawings. And in the corner, her janitor, the man from the cafe, the man from the lobby, was bent over a window, cloth in hand, unaware she had entered. Evelyn's instinct was to retreat, to avoid what didn't belong in her carefully ordered world, yet something held her in place. Her eyes lingered on the girl, on the way her small hand moved across paper with certainty, unbothered by the cold walls and unforgiving light. Emma looked up, sensing her presence. Their eyes met. Without hesitation, the girl tilted her head and asked, "Are you lonely too?" Evelyn blinked, stunned by the question. "Why would you say that?" she managed, her voice softer than she intended. Emma shrugged, returning her pencil to the paper. "Because you look like Daddy when he thinks no one's watching." The words landed heavier than any accusation Evelyn had ever faced. She, who had been called ruthless, merciless, even inhuman, suddenly found herself unarmored before a child's simple honesty. No corporate strategy, no carefully rehearsed defense could shield her from it. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Daniel turned then, realizing she was there. His eyes widened, moving quickly from his daughter to Evelyn, panic rising in his chest. "Emma!" he hissed, crossing the room. He gathered the scattered drawings with hurried hands. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." She didn't mean, "She talks too much sometimes." But Evelyn raised a hand slightly, stopping him without words. Her face gave nothing away, though her gaze lingered on the girl longer than she should have. Emma was already back to her sketches, unfazed, humming softly under her breath. Daniel's apology spilled into the room, clumsy and heavy, but Evelyn didn't hear it. Her mind was still caught on that single question echoing in the quiet. "Are you lonely too?" She nodded once, her expression unreadable, and turned toward the door. Without another word, she walked out, the click of her heels receding down the hall. Daniel stood frozen, shame twisting in his gut, until the silence swallowed them again. He looked down at Emma, who smiled faintly at her new drawing. "She's lonely," she said simply, as if stating the color of the sky. Daniel pressed a hand to his forehead, unable to answer. Out in the hall, Evelyn walked faster than usual, her heart unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with business. She had been cut open not by rivals or critics, but by a child who saw through walls she'd spent years building. And for the first time in a very long time, she wondered if those walls had been protecting her or just keeping her alone. Evelyn had built a career on not seeing what didn't matter. Janitors, assistants, drivers, the nameless background that kept the machinery of her empire moving, she had trained her eyes to slide past them without notice. Efficiency was acknowledging only what was essential, and in her world, people like Daniel Hollis were not. And yet, after that night in the conference room, after the child's question had cut through her composure like glass splintering, she found her gaze catching on him again and again. He was everywhere, though he never made a sound. Emptying trash bins while board members debated projections, straightening chairs after strategy meetings that left the air thick with ego, adjusting the flickering light in the hallway that no one else cared to fix, his hands steady, his movements patient, as though he believed even a bulb deserved its dignity. He never hurried, never complained, never sought to be seen, and perhaps that was why she couldn't look away. There was nothing glamorous in the way he worked, yet there was a weight to it, a quiet dignity that felt strangely out of place in a building designed to crush softness. He carried himself like someone who had already weathered storms worse than humiliation, someone who understood survival not as choice but as habit. Evelyn told herself she was only observing, analyzing, the way she would study a competitor, but sometimes she caught herself staring too long, and she hated the way it unsettled her. At night, in her penthouse overlooking the city, she found her eyes drawn again and again to the piano in the corner. Its black lacquered surface shone under the lamplight, flawless and untouched. She had once played long ago, before ambition had consumed every hour of her life. The keys were silent now, gathering dust in a room where silence had become the only music. Emma's words returned unbidden. "Are you lonely too?" She tried to shake them, but they clung to her. No investor had ever unnerved her, no rival had ever pierced her armor the way that small girl had with a single question. Evelyn wondered, not for the first time, if the walls she had built to hold power had in fact become her prison. Across the city, Daniel replayed the same scene in his head with a different weight. He scolded himself for letting Emma speak so freely, for not stopping her before the words tumbled out. Boldness might be charming in a child, but it could cost him his job. He could not afford even the shadow of trouble. Rent hovered like a storm cloud, bills spread across his table like accusations. One wrong move could undo what little balance he still clung to. And yet, he couldn't shake the image of Evelyn Cross freezing at his daughter's words. For a woman who commanded empires with the flick of a pen, she had looked suddenly human, even fragile, as though the child had exposed something she kept hidden from the world. Daniel didn't know why it haunted him, but it did. He didn't want to think of her beyond the title of CEO, didn't want to imagine that somewhere behind the suits and sharp lines there might be cracks. But he had seen it. He couldn't unsee it. The days moved forward in their parallel lines. Evelyn sat at her marble counter staring at untouched glasses of wine. Daniel walked the endless hallways, mop in hand, trying not to let his thoughts wander. Emma continued to draw her superheroes, capes trailing, eyes tired but kind. And sometimes Daniel wondered if she saw the world more clearly than he ever could. Neither Evelyn nor Daniel spoke of that night, but both carried it quietly, the memory of a single exchange that had shifted something deep beneath the surface. Two lives, orbiting closer without meaning to, drawn by forces neither of them fully understood. And though the walls remained, hairline cracks had begun to spread, thin as spider webs, but undeniable, letting in the first fragile light. The building was quieter than usual, its usual hum of voices and heels swallowed by the late hour. Most of the lights had been dimmed, but one conference room glowed faintly, its frosted glass spilling a muted rectangle into the hallway. Daniel pushed his cart slowly, the wheels groaning under the weight of rags and bottles, when he noticed her silhouette through the glass. Evelyn Cross, alone. He hesitated, wondering if he should skip the room and come back later, but before he could decide, her voice carried through the door. "Come in." He froze, then pushed the door open. The conference room was half lit, shadows pooling in the corners. A neat stack of papers sat untouched in front of her, her pen resting idle. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, posture straight but not rigid, her gaze fixed not on the numbers but on him. She gestured to the chair nearest him. "Sit." Daniel didn't move. "I'm just here to clean, ma'am." She studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, her tone softer than he'd ever heard. "Your daughter. She's very perceptive." The words tightened something in his chest. He set down the rag he'd been holding, shoulders stiffening. "She didn't mean disrespect," he said quickly, the defensiveness slipping out before he could stop it. Evelyn shook her head. "She meant truth." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. Daniel's jaw flexed as he weighed his words. He'd spent years keeping his head down, surviving by silence, but something about her tone, steady, certain, almost curious, unraveled his restraint. "Truth doesn't pay rent," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. Her eyes flickered at that, but she didn't flinch. She leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table, studying him as though she were seeing him for the first time. Men in tailored suits had pleaded across this table, negotiated, lied, groveled. She had built empires by dismantling people who never dared speak plainly. But this man, in his faded uniform, with calloused hands and dark circles beneath his eyes, gave her honesty without agenda. And it rattled her more than any hostile takeover ever had. Daniel shifted on his feet, wishing he hadn't said it, wishing he could pull the words back into his chest. He wasn't supposed to talk like that, not here, not to her. "I should finish up," he muttered, reaching for the rag again, but Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Do you always carry yourself like the world owes you nothing?" He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the marble-cut CEO, but a woman watching him with an intensity that unsettled him. He swallowed. "It doesn't," he said simply. The bluntness struck her like a cold wind. There was no bitterness in it, no plea for sympathy, just a fact delivered without apology. She felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her face composed. Years of boardrooms had taught her how to mask every flicker of reaction, but tonight the mask felt heavier than usual. Daniel gathered his supplies, the silence between them thick. He expected her to dismiss him, to remind him of his place, but she said nothing, only watched. And in that silence, Evelyn realized something she hadn't in years. She was not in control of the room. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, her voice followed him, lower this time, almost a murmur. "Your daughter was right." Daniel paused, hand on the doorframe. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His chest ached with too many unspoken things. When he finally stepped out into the dim corridor, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Evelyn remained in the half-lit room, staring at the untouched papers, her thoughts tangled. She had faced men who tried to topple her, industries that wanted her gone, but none of them had left her as shaken as a janitor who spoke the kind of truth no balance sheet could measure. Evelyn rarely allowed herself to be distracted. Every hour of her day was carved into efficiency, every meeting timed to the minute, every outcome measured in profit margins and headlines. Yet after that strange encounter in the half-lit conference room, she found herself thinking about Daniel far more than she wanted to admit. His words had lingered, raw and unpolished. Truth doesn't pay rent. They echoed in her mind long after the papers had been signed and the deals closed. Curiosity gnawed at her until she finally acted. One morning, in the same cool voice she used to request quarterly reports, she asked her assistant to run a background check. Discreetly, she added. No noise, no paper trail. She told herself it was protocol. She needed to know who was working in her building, who was letting their child sit at conference tables after hours. But she knew that wasn't the truth. She wanted to understand him, the man who moved like silence but carried himself with a dignity the walls of her empire seemed to lack. The report came within days, a slim folder, unremarkable in appearance, yet when she opened it, her breath caught. Daniel Hollis had been an architecture student once, one of the most promising in his class. His designs had won competitions, his models praised for innovation and grace. There were newspaper clippings, photos of smiling young men with rolled-up blueprints, and too much hope in their eyes. She paused at one grainy image of him, 10 years younger, lighter somehow, standing beside a model of a curved glass structure that looked like it might take flight. Then came the notes of what followed: his wife's illness, the hospital bills, his sudden withdrawal from the program. No degree, no firm, no career. Just a series of odd jobs until janitorial work became the only steady thread left to hold. A career never begun, a dream buried under survival. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt something she had carefully starved out of herself: guilt. She had built her world on ambition, on never stopping long enough to see who was trampled beneath her stride. She bulldozed rooms, toppled rivals, reduced men, twice her age, to whispers and apologies. And yet here was a man who had once carried the kind of talent she had always claimed to nurture, left with a mop in his hands instead of blueprints. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the grand desk in her penthouse, the city glittering beyond the glass walls. For reasons she couldn't explain, she pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her and picked up a pencil. She hadn't sketched since she was a child, not really. Numbers and contracts had long ago replaced lines and shapes. But now, almost against her will, her hand began to move. The lines were clumsy, uneven, lacking the confidence of memory. She tried to draw the arc of a roof, the shadow of a column, the sweep of something graceful, but the shapes came out stiff, incomplete. She frowned, pressing harder, then softer, erasing, starting again, her movements awkward and foreign. For someone who had built her name on mastery, the sight of her own inadequacy was unbearable. She dropped the pencil and leaned back, staring at the crooked sketch. A hollow laugh escaped her lips. This was what time had stolen. Whatever spark she might have once carried, sacrificed at the altar of ambition. And for what? Glass towers, yes. Balance sheets that glowed in green. Power, certainly. But sitting there in the quiet, confronted with her own shaky lines, she wondered if she had misunderstood the very thing she was chasing. Her empire was built on silence, on making sure no one saw her falter, no one heard her question herself. But silence, she realized, was not the same as strength. It was a prison. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Cross asked herself if success without softness, without creation, was really success at all. The invitation came disguised as routine. A memo about community outreach, a carefully worded announcement about strengthening ties and corporate responsibility. Evelyn's board had praised her initiative. Her assistant had organized the logistics, and no one questioned her motives. But beneath the polished press release and staged photo ops was a quieter intent. Evelyn had asked one person in particular if he might bring his daughter. She had stopped Daniel in the lobby 2 days before, her tone casual, her eyes too steady. "We're holding an event here for local families. Art, exhibits, music. Perhaps your daughter might enjoy it." Daniel hesitated, the weight of suspicion in his shoulders. His instinct was to say no. He had grown used to the thin line between kindness and charity, and too often kindness was only pity in disguise. But then he thought of Emma, how her world had shrunk to school, the apartment, and the dim corridors of his night shifts. She needed brightness, even if it came from a place he didn't trust. So reluctantly, he agreed. The evening of the event, the skyscraper's lobby looked transformed. Gone was the cold marble solemnity. In its place stood vibrant displays, local artwork, children's stations with crayons and paper, soft music floating under the hum of conversation. Families from the neighborhood wandered through in awe, their footsteps echoing against glass and stone that had never been meant for them. Emma's eyes widened the moment she stepped inside. Her hand tightened around Daniel's as she took in the colors, the sculptures, the tables filled with blank canvases waiting to be claimed. "Daddy, look," she whispered, tugging him toward a corner where children sat sprawled on the floor with markers and chalk. Daniel followed, though his posture stayed tense, his gaze flicking often to Evelyn. She stood near the entrance in a midnight blue dress, perfectly composed, yet oddly still. When she saw Emma, something shifted in her expression, softness breaking through the layers of steel she wore like armor. She didn't step forward, not right away. She only watched, as though afraid to disturb the fragile glow beginning to bloom across the girl's face. Emma dropped to the floor, crayon in hand, and began sketching furiously. Towers stretched across the page, bright windows, a sweep of clouds above them. A castle, but not the kind from fairy tales. This one floated, held aloft by colors more than stone. When she finished, she looked around, spotted Evelyn at last, and without hesitation crossed the lobby to her. "Here," Emma said, holding up the page. Her cheeks flushed with pride. "It's a castle in the sky." Evelyn took the drawing carefully, as though it were glass. The crayon marks were uneven, childlike, yet there was something about the image that pierced her, a place unreachable, imagined, yet desperately wanted. Her voice caught before she managed to whisper, "Maybe one day we'll build it." Daniel, who had followed, stopped short at her words. His first instinct was anger, or maybe defense. He didn't want pity, didn't want his daughter's dreams to become some billionaire's charity project. He bristled, jaw tightening. But then he caught the look in Evelyn's eyes. It wasn't patronizing. It wasn't the polished mask of a woman used to being admired. It was longing. The same kind he sometimes saw in Emma when she asked if they'd ever live somewhere with a garden, or in his own reflection when he pulled old blueprints from a drawer he never opened. Evelyn knelt slightly, lowering herself to Emma's height, the drawing pressed close to her chest. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you for showing me." Emma grinned, satisfied, and skipped back to the floor to begin another creation. Daniel lingered beside Evelyn, torn between gratitude and resentment, his pride battling the unfamiliar tug of something else, hope maybe, or recognition. Evelyn didn't look at him, but her voice carried enough to reach his ears. "Castles in the sky," she murmured, "the only ones worth building." And for the first time, Daniel couldn't decide if her words unsettled him or pulled him closer. All he knew was that they stayed with him long after the crayons had been put away, and the castle still floated, fragile and bright, in his daughter's hands. The envelope sat on the counter like a warning flare. Daniel tore it open slowly, though he already knew. "Notice to vacate, 30 days. The words stared back at him, sharp and merciless. His chest hollowed as though the air had been pulled from the room. He folded the paper in half, then in half again, until it was nothing but a tight square of quiet devastation shoved into his pocket. Emma was at the table, bent over her sketchbook, humming softly as she drew a cape around a stick-figure hero. She looked up and grinned. "Does this one look like you, Daddy?" Daniel forced a smile, nodding, even as the weight of the notice pressed against his leg like a stone. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice light, careful, stronger than ever. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head, swallowing the ache. He couldn't let her see the truth, not yet. Across the city, Evelyn sat in a boardroom with men who smelled of cologne and strategy. They spoke in clipped tones, circling her like wolves dressed in bespoke suits. Words like distraction and image were tossed around the polished table. One even dared to suggest her leadership was slipping. She met their stares without blinking, her jaw set, though something in her chest burned. She had built this empire brick by brick, and now the people who once praised her were waiting for the first crack to widen. "Your focus has shifted," one of them said carefully, though his smile was sharp. "You've been elsewhere." Elsewhere. The word lingered. They didn't know where. They didn't know why. But she did, and the knowledge unsettled her more than their whispers. By the time night wrapped the city in its hollow glow, both Daniel and Evelyn carried burdens that pressed into bone. Daniel scrubbed floors and polished glass with mechanical precision. exhaustion trailing him like a shadow. The worksite was nearly empty, lights dimmed to save electricity. His arms ached, his legs trembled, his back screamed from bending too long. Still he pushed on. Survival didn't care about fatigue. Survival demanded obedience, but even survival has limits. Near midnight, his body gave way. He sank into a chair in one of the side corridors, head falling forward, mop still leaning against his shoulder. His breath came ragged, then slowed. The kind of weariness that doesn't ask permission. He didn't mean to close his eyes, he just did. Evelyn was still in the building. She often was, lingering long after the others had left, pacing the edges of her glass office like a restless ghost. Tonight, her steps had carried her down unfamiliar halls, searching for stillness she couldn't find in numbers. When she saw him, she froze. Daniel slumped in the chair, his uniform wrinkled, his face pale under the harsh light. For a moment he looked less like a man asleep and more like a man undone. His hands were calloused, his shoulders bowed, his breathing shallow. Evelyn stood in the doorway, the sharp retort she might usually carry caught in her throat. No one had ever dared fall apart in her building. And yet here he was, not daring at all, just collapsing under a weight he could no longer carry. Slowly, almost cautiously, she stepped closer. Her heels clicked softly on the floor until she stopped beside him. He didn't stir. The mop slid from his shoulder and clattered to the ground, but he didn't wake. Evelyn's gaze lingered on his face, the lines carved there not by age, but by exhaustion and survival. She slipped off her coat, tailored, expensive, meant for boardrooms, not hallways, and draped it over him. It hung awkwardly, too fine for his rough frame, but it was warmth nonetheless. For once, she didn't analyze the gesture, didn't question the optics. There was no agenda here, only instinct, only compassion. She stood for a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the silence that pressed between them. Then she turned, gathered herself, and walked back into the shadows of her empire, leaving him with her coat as the only trace that she had been there at all. For Evelyn Cross, who had built a life on cold precision, it was the smallest act, but for the first time in years, it felt like something real. Daniel spotted her in the lobby the next morning, the sunlight slanting through the tall windows and striking the polished marble floor so bright it made his eyes ache. Evelyn Cross stood near the elevator, flanked by two assistants, her presence as sharp and deliberate as always. But when her gaze flicked over to him, just for a heartbeat, he felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on his chest. He could have walked past, kept his head bowed, pushed his cart into the service hall like he always did. Instead, something stopped him. Maybe it was the coat folded neatly in his locker, the scent of her perfume still clinging faintly to the fabric. Maybe it was the exhaustion of years of silence breaking all at once. He set the mop aside and stepped forward. "Why are you doing this?" His voice was low but edged, carrying more steel than he intended. The assistants glanced at each other, startled by the intrusion. Evelyn dismissed them with a flick of her hand. When they were gone, she turned fully toward him, expression unreadable. "Because I see you," she said simply. Daniel almost laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "You don't see me. You see what you want. A project, a distraction, something to make you feel—" "What? Generous?" Her eyes sharpened, but her tone stayed calm. "No, you're more than this job. I know what you gave up." That stopped him, just for a second. His heart thudded unevenly, suspicion rising like a wall. "You've been digging," he accused. "I wanted to understand," she admitted, no shame in her voice. "Architecture, competitions, work that should have taken you far." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't belong behind a mop, Daniel." He met her gaze, anger sparking in the dark of his eyes. "And what about you?" His voice roughened, like gravel dragged across stone. "What did you give up to stand here in heels and glass towers? What part of you did you bury so you could wear power like armor?" The question cut her deeper than she expected. For a moment her mask slipped. Her breath caught, the polished lines of her face flickering with something raw, something she hadn't let surface in years. Memories she didn't want rose too quickly. Late nights at the piano she never touched anymore. Childhood sketches crumpled in drawers. Conversations with her mother about winning at all costs. She had buried it all under skyscrapers of control. She swallowed hard, but no words came. Daniel saw it, the fracture in her composure, and his anger softened just enough to feel dangerous. He turned away first, shaking his head as though to rid himself of the moment. "This doesn't change anything," he muttered. "I still clean floors. I still get eviction notices. Seeing me won't fix that." Evelyn exhaled, steadying herself. "And ignoring you won't fix me." The silence between them was thick, alive, charged like the pause before a storm. They stood there, two people from worlds that should never collide, staring at each other with too many truths wedged between them. Finally, Daniel picked up his mop again, retreating toward the service hall without another word. Evelyn didn't stop him. She only watched, the echo of his question still slicing through her like a blade. "What did you give up to get here?" That night, Daniel replayed the exchange in his head as he tucked Emma into bed. Her small hand clutched his shirt as she drifted off, and he thought of Evelyn's eyes, how they had flickered when he asked the question she couldn't answer. And in her penthouse, Evelyn stood before the untouched piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys, the weight of his words heavy in her chest. Neither of them slept easily. The tension hung between them still, thick as smoke, impossible to ignore. The kitchen table was crowded with crayons, glue sticks, and sheets of construction paper, the clutter of a school project spread out like the beginnings of something larger. Emma sat with her legs swinging under the chair, chewing thoughtfully on the end of a marker. "It's supposed to be a dream building," she said, frowning at the blank sheet in front of her. "But I don't know how to make it look right." Daniel sat across from her, rubbing the back of his neck. He was exhausted from another long shift, the ache in his shoulders a constant reminder of the life he carried. Still, when Emma slid the paper toward him, eyes wide and expectant, he sighed and picked up a pencil. "A dream building, huh?" "What kind of dream?" "One with windows everywhere," she said quickly, her hands painting the air with invisible walls. "And gardens on the roof. And light that never turns off." Daniel chuckled softly, the sound tinged with sadness. He touched the pencil to the paper, his hand uncertain at first. Lines came shaky, hesitant, but then something shifted. His fingers remembered what his mind had buried. Curves smoothed out, angles sharpened, details slipped into place, as if they had only been sleeping. He sketched a structure that seemed to breathe, slender towers reaching toward the sky, layered terraces cascading with imagined greenery, arches that bent light into something almost holy. Emma leaned in, her mouth falling open as she watched the building take form under his hand. "You're amazing, Dad," she whispered, as if afraid to disturb the magic. Daniel paused, the pencil still between his fingers. For a moment he let himself see it too, not just the sketch, but the man he had been once, the one who believed in creating things that could outlast storms. Then the weight of reality pressed down again, and he set the pencil aside. "It's just lines on paper, Em." "No," she said firmly, clutching the page before he could push it away. "It's real." "You have to show her." "Show who?" He already knew the answer. "Miss Cross." Emma's eyes shone with certainty. "She'll understand. She'll know it's special." Daniel shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "That's not a good idea." "Why not?" "Because she's different. People like her don't look at drawings like this and see anything but a hobby." His voice was flat, protective, though something inside him flinched at the lie. But Emma didn't yield. She folded the paper carefully, tucking it against her chest as though guarding treasure. "You always tell me to be brave." "This is brave," and Daniel had no answer for that. 2 nights later, he found himself outside Evelyn's office, Emma at his side, clutching the sketch. Evelyn looked up when they entered, her expression as composed as ever, though her gaze softened slightly at the sight of the girl. Emma marched forward and set the folded page on Evelyn's desk. "My dad made this," she said proudly. Evelyn opened it slowly, smoothing the creases with delicate fingers. Her eyes traced the lines, following the curves, the depth, the vision buried within the paper. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. She didn't speak for a long time. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, wishing he had stopped this. He hated the vulnerability of it, hated that a single sheet of paper could expose so much of what he'd lost. Finally, Evelyn's voice broke the quiet, low and steady. "This belongs on a skyline." Emma beamed, her smile so wide it nearly split her face. Daniel, however, looked away, his throat tight. Pride and pain wrestled in his chest. Dreams felt dangerous when survival demanded you keep your head down. But in the reflection of the glass walls, he saw his daughter's joy and Evelyn's unguarded awe. And for one fragile moment, he let himself believe the lines on paper might still matter. The photo appeared first on a gossip site, then on every screen Daniel passed that morning. A grainy shot but unmistakable, him in his faded jacket, Emma holding both their hands, Evelyn crossed beside them, sharp in her midnight dress. The caption screamed louder than the picture, "CEO and janitor? Scandal or charity case?" By noon, the words had spread like fire. By evening, Daniel's name, his name, was on people's lips who had never noticed him before. He tried to shield Emma from it, walking her home from school with his shoulders squared against the whispers. But even she noticed the glances, the subtle shift in the air, the way people looked at them as though they had stumbled into a story that didn't belong to them. At the skyscraper, the tension thickened. Board members closed ranks around Evelyn, their voices sharp, their demands pointed. "You need to explain this," one of them said, waving the tabloid like evidence at a trial. "Call it outreach, call it charity, but distance yourself." Quickly, Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her face unreadable. She could have said it, could have leaned on the narrative that he was nothing more than a human interest case, a moment of kindness. But when she opened her mouth, the words wouldn't come. She refused to humiliate him like that. She refused to humiliate herself with a lie. "There's nothing to explain," she said evenly, her voice calm against the rising storm. "I attended my company's community event, that's all." It was not the answer they wanted. The silence that followed was colder than accusation. Meanwhile, Daniel carried the weight of it differently. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this, not with headlines framing his life as spectacle. He felt the walls of his world tremble, his job already fragile, his dignity already battered, and most of all, Emma's stability. Everything he had fought to protect felt like it was slipping through his hands. He paced the apartment late that night, voice low but rough with frustration. "I can't let this ruin us. I can't let them take what little we have left." Emma, who had been coloring quietly in the corner, lifted her head. Her voice was small but clear. "Are we the problem?" The words stopped him cold. He turned, eyes wide, his breath caught in his throat. She was staring at him with that unflinching honesty only children carry, her hands clutching the crayon so tightly the paper tore beneath it. "No," he said immediately, crossing the room to kneel beside her. His voice cracked and he pressed a hand to her cheek. "Never. You're not the problem. You're the only thing that's ever been right." But even as he spoke, his chest ached. Because somewhere deep inside, the fear coiled tighter. Maybe the problem was him. Maybe stepping out of invisibility had been a mistake. Maybe survival demanded silence, not exposure. He had learned long ago how to disappear, how to blend into the corners where the world didn't bother to look. And for the first time in years, he wondered if staying invisible had been safer for both of them. In her penthouse, Evelyn stood at the window, the skyline glittering but blurred by her reflection. She thought of the girl's drawing, the castle in the sky, of Daniel's eyes when she had said it belonged on a skyline. She thought of the board, of their cold fury, of the headlines that turned a moment into scandal. And beneath all of it, she thought of the way Emma had looked at her that night, trusting, unafraid. The storm outside was loud now, wind rattling the glass, rain streaking the view. But the real storm was in the space between them all. A man who wanted to stay invisible, a child who only spoke in truths, and a woman who could no longer hide behind the silence she had built her empire on. The boardroom was a theater of glass and steel, its long table gleaming beneath the sterile light, its walls designed to reflect power back at the people who sat inside. The men and women around Evelyn spoke in practice tones, polished and sharp, their words as cold as the marble beneath their feet. "This scandal is unsustainable," one of them said, sliding a tabloid across the table as though presenting evidence in a trial. The photo stared back again, her, Daniel, and Emma, a triangle of humanity reduced to spectacle. "You need to create distance. Fire him. Restore control of the narrative." Another leaned forward, his voice harder. "If you don't, we will. The shareholders demand stability. The press will not forgive weakness." Evelyn sat perfectly still, hands folded, gaze level. Inside something stirred, not the usual surge of calculation, not the hunger for dominance, but a quiet clarity. She looked at the photo, at Emma's small hand clasping both of theirs, and felt the weight of every decision that had brought her here. For years she had defined her worth by skyscrapers, by signatures on contracts, by the silence of men who couldn't match her. But what had it cost? Her mother's voice rose in memory. "Winning isn't about being better. It's about making them believe you never bleed." Evelyn had lived by that creed, carving her way through a world that never wanted her to lead. And now? Now a child's question, "Are you lonely too?" had undone her armor more thoroughly than decades of war. The voices around her pressed harder. "Say it was pity. Say you were helping him. That's all anyone needs to hear." Her jaw tightened. Slowly, deliberately she pushed the tabloid aside. Then she rose. Her chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the brittle silence. "Some things," she said, her voice steady, "are worth more than image." She let her eyes sweep across them, each face reflecting disbelief, irritation, even fear. "And some things are worth building." The room stilled. A few shifted uncomfortably. One of the older men scoffed. "Don't be naive, Evelyn. You've spent your career proving you're not." She shook her head. "I've spent my career proving I can play a game I never believed in. I built towers out of steel and glass, yes, but none of it feels alive. Not the way a child's drawing does, not the way honesty does." Someone muttered, "What are you saying?" Evelyn inhaled, the decision already rooted in her chest. "I'm saying you can have it. The company, the board, the empire. I resign." The words dropped like stone into still water. Gasps, a stunned silence. Someone whispered her name in disbelief. She watched them scramble, their expressions flickering between triumph and panic, but she felt none of it. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She wasn't defending. She was simply choosing. When she left the boardroom, her heels clicking across marble, her heart pounded, not with fear but with something sharper, freedom. Across town, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, bills spread like battlefield maps. The eviction notice lay on top, a grim banner. Emma's drawings were stacked neatly in a shoebox he couldn't bear to leave behind. He folded clothes into cardboard boxes, each crease weighted with resignation. He told himself it was inevitable, that Evelyn Cross had been a momentary distraction, a fleeting presence destined to vanish like everyone else who had once promised more. He couldn't let himself believe she was different. He couldn't afford the cost of disappointment again. Emma tugged at his sleeve. "Where are we going, Daddy?" He forced a smile, ruffling her hair. "Somewhere new." "We'll make it work." His voice carried a certainty he didn't feel. What he didn't know was that Evelyn, blueprint in hand, was already on her way. Not a corporate plan, not a glossy proposal, but a sketch drawn with the shaky lines of someone remembering how to dream. For the first time, she wasn't coming to offer him pity. She was coming to build something unsteady, unpolished, but real. Daniel opened the door expecting another notice, another neighbor's complaint, another reminder of how close everything was to falling apart. Instead, Evelyn Cross stood there, not in her usual armor of tailored suits, but in a simple coat, a rolled set of papers tucked under her arm. For a moment he just stared, unable to fit her into the doorway of his crumbling apartment. She didn't belong against peeling paint and flickering light bulbs. And yet, there she was. "I need to show you something," she said. Her voice wasn't commanding like it usually was in the halls of her tower. It was quieter, almost uncertain. Daniel stepped aside reluctantly, and she walked in. Emma, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons scattered around her, looked up and grinned. "Miss Cross?" she said, as if Evelyn were a character from one of her stories. Evelyn smiled faintly, then set the rolled papers on the table and spread them open. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't sterile. It was a design, messy in its first strokes, but alive with possibility. Rooms filled with light, open spaces for collaboration. Walls meant not to divide but to welcome. At the top of the page, her neat handwriting read, "Community Design Studio." Daniel hovered by the table, arms crossed. "What's this?" "A place," Evelyn said, "for voices that never get heard. For single parents who sketch dreams on napkins. For kids who draw castles in the sky. For the ones who were told they didn't belong in the skyline. A studio where they can create without fear." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "And I want you to lead it." A sharp laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Bitter, rough. "Me?" "I'm a janitor." Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out 2 folded sheets. She placed Emma's crayon castle beside one of his old blueprints. The child's dream pressed against the faded lines of his abandoned past. "You're more than this job," she said softly. "You've always been more. You're an architect of hope, Daniel. Don't you see it?" The room went quiet. Emma looked from one face to the other, her small hand resting gently on her father's sleeve. Daniel stared at the drawings, his throat tight. For years, survival had beaten dreams out of him, each unpaid bill and each rejection letter, carving deeper into the belief that it was foolish to want more. But here, in the hands of the woman he least expected, was the proof that those dreams hadn't died. They'd only been buried, waiting. He swallowed hard. "You're serious." "I am," she said. "No pretense, no boardroom polish, just truth." The silence stretched, thick and trembling. Daniel felt the walls around him shift, the floor he had scrubbed on his knees for years suddenly trembling beneath his feet, as if it might become something else. A foundation, not of marble or glass, but of second chances. He pressed a hand to the back of his neck, staring at the papers. "I don't know if I can." Evelyn's voice softened even more. "You don't have to know. You just have to begin." Emma squeezed his arm, her voice small but fierce. "You can, Daddy. You already built things in your head all the time. Now you get to build them for real." Daniel looked at her, at Evelyn, at the drawings on the table. For the first time in years, the word impossible didn't feel so permanent. His world shifted, unsteady but alive. He wasn't just cleaning someone else's foundation anymore. For the first time, he saw the chance to design his own. The studio smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, the kind of scent that promised beginnings. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching on jars of markers and stacks of scrap paper piled on mismatched tables. The walls, once blank and cold, now bore streaks of color where children had pressed their palms dipped in paint, leaving behind small, imperfect signatures of joy. Daniel stood at the front of the room, holding a roll of butcher paper that unspooled across the floor. "Today we're going to design a playground," he told the group of kids seated cross-legged in a circle. "Not the one you already have, the one you wish for." Eyes lit up, pencils and crayons scratching furiously as rockets, castles, and twisted slides took shape on paper. Emma darted between them, offering encouragement, her hair bouncing in a messy ponytail. She had become the unofficial mascot of the space, darting from table to table with the kind of boundless energy adults could only envy. "That's awesome," she told one boy, drawing a dragon-shaped swing. "You should make the tail a slide, too." And then there was Evelyn. She wasn't in her usual tailored suits. Today she wore rolled-up sleeves and sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook balanced on her knee. She leaned into a cluster of children debating the right number of windows for their dream treehouse. Instead of directing, she asked questions. How would the light feel inside? Would it be a secret hideout or a place for everyone? Her voice was gentle, curious, without the sharp edges that once carved boardrooms into silence. Daniel watched her from across the room, astonishment flickering across his features. This was the woman who had once spoken with the weight of a hammer, who measured success in quarterly reports and headlines. Now she sat in the midst of children with crayons staining her fingers, nodding earnestly as if every answer were sacred. For the first time she wasn't leading, she was listening. The space hummed with life. Laughter bubbled against the walls. Paper rustled, crayons snapped, ideas collided and grew. Where once there had been silence, there was now a chorus of voices unafraid to dream out loud. Daniel felt something unfurl inside him he hadn't known was still alive, the quiet pride of watching creation bloom, not from himself alone, but from those who had been told their voices didn't matter. Late that night, after the last child had left and Emma had fallen asleep curled up on a beanbag, the studio grew still again. Daniel stacked chairs while Evelyn lingered by the window, her reflection faint against the city lights outside. She turned when she heard his footsteps. For once, she didn't look like the unshakable figure who commanded skyscrapers. She looked smaller, her voice low and unguarded. "I don't know if I can be more than what I was," she admitted. The words slipped out as though she hadn't meant to let them, as though confessing vulnerability still felt dangerous. Daniel studied her for a moment, leaning against the table. He understood too well the weight of trying to become someone different when the world only remembered who you'd been. He shook his head softly. "Then don't be more," he said. "Just be real." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was steady, like the settling of a foundation. Evelyn's gaze lingered on his, the distance between them narrowing, not with dramatic declarations, but with something quieter, more dangerous: trust. She looked down at her hands, faint streaks of blue crayon still on her skin, and let out a small laugh. "Real," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice a whisper, almost lost to the quiet. "That's enough." And in that moment, surrounded by walls alive with children's drawings and the echo of laughter, both of them knew that something had shifted. The bond between them wasn't forced, wasn't staged. It was building itself slowly, the way true things always do. The morning of the opening dawned bright, the kind of crisp air that carried a hint of new beginnings. Outside the renovated space, cameras clustered like curious birds, reporters murmuring as though waiting for the first crack in glass. They had come hungry for scandal, for spectacle, for the sight of Evelyn Cross on shaky ground. Instead, when the doors opened, they were greeted not with corporate polish, but with color. Walls alive with murals painted by small hands, tables scattered with crayons, chalk drawings spilling across the floor like uncontained imagination. Families streamed in, hesitant at first, then softened by the warmth inside. Children darted toward the art stations, their laughter ricocheting off the high ceilings. The scent of markers and fresh wood replaced the sterile tang of corporate lobbies. The air itself felt different, less like a business opening, and more like a gathering of something fragile, tender, and real. Daniel stood near the front, tugging at the cuff of a borrowed jacket. He was unsteady in the spotlight, a man more used to blending into the corners than facing cameras, But when he glanced toward the side of the room, he saw Emma, her face glowing with pride, her hands clapping as she bounced on her toes. That steadied him. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I've been called a failure," he began, his voice carrying more weight than volume. The room quieted, the reporters lowering their pens just enough to listen. "I've been called a janitor. Invisible. Someone who cleans up what's left behind." He paused, scanning the space filled with color and movement. His eyes found Emma again, who gave him a thumbs up, the kind only a child could make, both earnest and commanding. "But here," Daniel continued, his voice steadier now, "I'm not invisible. I'm not what I lost. I'm just a father who remembered how to build." The words landed like stone against water, rippling outward until the silence broke into applause. Not polite, not forced, but genuine, the kind that comes when people hear something they recognize in themselves. Daniel stepped back, his chest rising and falling, and in his daughter's beaming face he saw something stronger than pride: belief. Evelyn crossed the stage then, no longer the ice-bound executive who had once towered above boardrooms. She wore no armor of tailored suits, no mask of indifference. Her sleeves were rolled, her hand still stained faintly from helping paint the murals only days before. She looked out at the crowd, at the cameras, at the curious faces waiting for her to defend herself. But she didn't defend. She didn't justify. She only told the truth. "This isn't about saving anyone," she said, her voice clear, her gaze steady. "It's about seeing them." Too often we look past people, decide their worth before we've listened. This place is proof that brilliance, hope, and belonging don't come wrapped in titles or resumes. They live here, in every sketch, every laugh, every dream we've been too busy to notice. Her words filled the room, soft but undeniable. For the first time, the cameras didn't look hungry. They looked still, like even the lenses were listening. Emma burst forward then, breaking the hush with her small, fierce joy. She ran onto the stage and grabbed her father's hand, tugging hard enough to make him laugh despite himself. "We did it, Dad!" she shouted, her voice carrying higher than microphones. "We really did it!" Daniel knelt, pulling her into his arms as the crowd erupted again. Evelyn stood just beside them, her expression softened by something she hadn't let herself feel in years. In that moment, it didn't matter what the headlines would print tomorrow. It didn't matter what the board had threatened, what the world whispered. What mattered was the sound of Emma's voice, bright and unashamed, and the way Daniel's shoulders straightened as though he finally believed he belonged in the light. For the first time, everything felt worth it. The echoes of laughter and applause had long since faded, leaving the studio draped in a gentler kind of silence. The murals on the walls seemed to glow in the dimmed light, the colors richer somehow without the distraction of cameras and voices. Crayon-scribbled castles, chalk rainbows across the floor, towers and bridges drawn by small, hopeful hands. Every corner of the space held a piece of the day that had just unfolded. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, tongue poking out in concentration as she doodled in her sketchbook. Her crayons were scattered around her like fallen petals. She hummed quietly, the sound steady, the melody a rhythm she seemed to carry wherever she went. On the page, 3 figures took shape beneath a bright arch of colors. A man with tired but kind eyes, a little girl with a wild ponytail, and a woman with hair swept back, her face softened in ways the real one rarely allowed. Evelyn leaned against one of the tables, her heels abandoned somewhere by the door. She was barefoot, her legs stretched out, sipping cheap coffee from a paper cup that had come from the corner store. For a woman who had once measured her worth in glass towers and rare vintages, she looked strangely content with the most ordinary of comforts. She tilted her head back, eyes half closed, as though letting herself breathe in a way she rarely permitted. Daniel sat nearby, his elbows resting on his knees, watching Emma's crayon lines fill the page. He was quiet, but his silence wasn't heavy the way it used to be. When Emma held up her sketch, proud of the family beneath the rainbow, he took it gently, studying it for a long moment. "She drew you with us," he said softly, glancing at Evelyn. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly. She set the coffee cup aside and straightened, her expression flickering with something she usually kept buried. "And how do you feel about that?" Daniel looked at the drawing again, then at Emma, whose eyes shone with unfiltered belief. Finally, his gaze met Evelyn's. "Like maybe home isn't a place," he said, his voice low but sure. "Maybe it's people." The words lingered in the air, tender and raw, filling the space more fully than any applause had earlier. For a long moment, none of them moved. The quiet was not empty, but alive, a silence built on trust instead of absence. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat tight. She leaned forward slightly, her voice almost a whisper. "Then let's stay." Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something he hadn't dared feel in years, hope, cautious but real. He nodded, a small, steady motion that spoke louder than words. Emma beamed, her little hands clutching her crayons as though sealing the promise. The three of them sat together in that empty studio, surrounded by walls, alive with children's dreams and the faint hum of the city outside. For the first time in years, none of them felt alone. Not the janitor who had once believed invisibility was survival, not the CEO who had worn coldness like armor, not the child who had asked the questions neither of them were brave enough to face. The building seemed to hum with them, as though it understood what it had become, not just a studio, not just a project, but a place where second chances could take root, where broken things could be shaped into something whole again. Emma bent her head back over her sketchbook, adding stars above the rainbow. Daniel reached for the coffee Evelyn had set aside, taking a sip, grimacing at its bitterness, then handing it back. She laughed, a sound lighter than he'd ever heard from her, and for a fleeting second it felt like they'd been sitting like this forever. Home wasn't walls or titles or even permanence. It was this, three people in the quiet, choosing not to leave. And the building itself seemed to agree, its silence steady, filled with the low, certain hum of second chances. If this story touched you even a little, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part resonated with you most. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story of hope, second chances, and the quiet kind of love that changes everything.